I want to welcome everyone to the American Security Projects event, An Evolving World Order, the Geopolitics of Climate Change. We're going to get about a minute here to let Zoom populate. So if you just bear with us for a second while that happens, and then I'll fire this thing up. And I'm hoping that's enough time. I'm Steve Chaney. I'm the president of the American Security Project. I've been with them some 15 years now, 10 years as the CEO and now as the president. To give you just a little background on the American Security Project, founded 2004, 2005 by some folks you probably know, Senators Kerry, Hagel, Hart, and Rudman, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. And the thought back then was, following the 2004 election, of which Senator Kerry was not particularly pleased, when he mentioned climate change, he oftentimes got painted as the left-wing liberal that he is. And he said that the message just wasn't getting across. So his thought at that juncture was to let's put together a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan, that can speak to this issue from a national security perspective. And we'll populate the board with recently retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals, 2 from each service. And then we'll get another equal number of business folks to finance the operation, and another equal number to help come as professionals in academia and from government that can fill out our board. And it's worked. And since then, we've had several members that are still with us, still talk this issue. Kerry was still on our board until he assumed his latest position, which government mandated he resign. And of course, we still have Chuck Hagel on our board as well. Our current chairperson is Christine Todd Whitman, former governor of New Jersey and head of the EPA under Bush 43. So that gives you a little bit of background, and we've had an intense interest in climate change and its impact on national security. But today we're going to talk a little bit about the geopolitics of climate change, and particularly talk about China and Russia. Let me lay some ground rules out there for you. First off, this is being taped. It's on the record. We'll have it up on our website tomorrow sometime, so just be aware of that. Order of talk, I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes. As King Henry VIII told several of his wives, I won't keep you very long. Then I'll turn it over to Dr. Lewis. And Dr. Lewis, you're free to talk as long as you would please. And following her remarks, I'll give it to Jonathan Elkind. Then we might do a little, depending on how much time we have, back and forth between the 3 of us. And then I'll open it up to Q&A. On the Q&A session, for those who are listening in, there's a Q&A box. If you would hit that box, type in your question, and they'll feed those to me, and hopefully we'll be able to take as many as we can. I mentioned that today's focus is really going to be China and Russia, and we have 2 great experts on this. Now, everybody's aware that last Saturday, the United States and China released a joint statement pledging to cooperate to address the climate crisis, which is a nice turnaround for the way things have been in the past several years. And in addition, to me, somewhat of a surprise, Russian President Vladimir Putin will also deliver a speech at the summit. So we're including the 2 big ones, if you will. And it's more clear than ever now that climate change is really playing a clear role in global strategic competition, and it can't be separated necessarily from geopolitical and geoeconomic interest. Climate policy is no longer just an extension, as many thought of, as from environmental policy. It's continued to be used as a key instrument of soft power and leadership, certainly on the world stage, and we'll talk about this. You know, as demonstrated in the last weekend, the United States needs to collaborate with China on climate change, while continuing to, as we know, strategically compete against China's expanding realm of influence. And you've certainly seen that with the current administration. China is investing in and exporting clean energy technology, not because it's altruistic, but because it really sees it as an investment, and somewhat as an investment instrument of power. You may know that China is the world's largest producer of solar panels, largest producer of wind turbines, batteries, and electric vehicles. And it's also been a top investor in clean energy use now for 9 of the last 10 years, and some haven't recognized that specific fact. There's some other aspects to what's going on in climate change in regards to security. We're all familiar that the melting Arctic is providing new challenges and complexities, certainly with the US-Russia relationship. And as we know, it's going to be new navigation interests up there and new extraction opportunities for Russia. Putin has put some big emphasis on what's going on in the Arctic. We think that the US should utilize its technological prowess as an instrument of power on climate change, that we needed to help to bolster our alliances and restore our leadership position in the world. One of our many strengths is our innovation and global technological prowess. We ought to be using that to full advantage. And as we will hear today, the US can regain its seat at the table and work to be a global leader through climate change, which my personal opinion is we've not been doing for the last 4 years. We are very, very fortunate today to have 2 very distinguished panelists with us who are experts on climate and energy issues, particularly as it relates to China and Russia. Dr. Joanna Lewis is the Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of Energy and Environment and Director of Science, Technology, and International Affairs Program at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. 2 decades plus of experience working on international climate and clean energy policy with a focus on China. She is a faculty affiliate in the China Energy Group at the U.S. Department of Energy's Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and is the author of the award-winning book, Green Innovation in China, and was a lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 5th Assessment Report. So, Dr. Lewis, welcome aboard. And following her will be Jonathan Elkind. He's a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy. He's devoted a long and distinguished career to energy and environment policy in the private and public sectors. From 2009 to 2017, worked on international energy and climate issues at the U.S. Department of Energy, and ended his tenure there as Assistant Secretary for International Affairs. He founded Eastlink Consulting LLC, where he guided corporate and nonprofit clients on commercial energy projects in Europe and Eurasia. And he served as a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, researching international energy security issues. So we've got a full plate today. I look forward to a great conversation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Lewis.
Great, thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation and looking forward to this conversation. So this is, of course, a very exciting week in climate. We have the US Leaders Summit later this week. And then, of course, Special Envoy Kerry is just back from China, and we saw the release of the first US-China joint statement on climate change in over 4 years over the weekend. But before I turn to current events, I wanted to provide some context and background on China's posture in international climate negotiations, specifically, and then in climate geopolitics more generally. And especially in terms of how domestic politics and domestic energy and emissions context in China plays into its interactions with other nations. So to start, I think it's important to recognize that while many are quick to call China a climate leader, China has historically been really a very reluctant leader in global environmental forums and particularly in the international climate negotiations. In part, I think due to the technical and the political challenges that it faces curbing carbon emissions and reducing its reliance on fossil fuels. China still gets the majority of its energy from coal, about 60% of total energy consumption and 65% of electricity generation. And China's contributions to climate change, namely, greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel combustion and industrial activity, are inherently linked to its core economic development strategy. And so Beijing's approach toward climate change, I think, must be understood within the broader context of its overall energy development strategy, which is driven by the economic development goals. And if China's energy situation is, essentially the main constraint to its climate policy position, the industrial prospect for low carbon development is the main driver, I think, behind the more aggressive elements of its position. As was mentioned, of course, China is a leader in many clean energy technology industries. And I think the promise of clean energy technology industries and the accompanying jobs, market opportunities, and overall economic benefit are really core elements of China's national industrial policy strategy. We see this very clearly and have aligned in that way with China's international climate policy position to drive this focus domestically and internationally on low carbon energy development. So China's energy challenges shape the way that its leadership approach climate mitigation at the domestic level, and that in turn shapes its positioning in international climate negotiations. And so I think as a result, we see relatively recent changes in China's domestic energy policy agenda, particularly over the last decade, which have really permitted a change in China's approach to global environmental diplomacy and to the climate negotiations specifically. I think this really has roots in the central government's emphasis on energy efficiency, really beginning with the 10th, 11th five-year plan, followed by a dramatic push for low carbon energy development, and then now the regulation of carbon emissions through the launch of the world's largest emissions trading system. And these domestic programs have been motivated by energy security concerns and industrial policy objectives that have been, I think potentially have very important implications for climate mitigation due to the synergies there. And so, I think another piece that is maybe less well appreciated is the increase we've seen in China, again, over the last decade plus, in the scientific and technical understanding of its own energy situation and emission situation, bolstered by really sustained investments in scientific capacity in this field. And this has allowed China's policymakers to legislate with more confidence, essentially. This means that while it's still a somewhat reluctant player, I think, in the international climate negotiations, the evolution in this domestic situation has led to a dramatic shift in the way that it interacts with the world on climate change issues. So, for the most part, China's climate commitments are directly aligned with those made at the domestic level. So for, last month, we saw the release of the 14th five-year plan, and the targets announced there are a means of putting the country on track to achieve its Paris goals, which currently extend through 2030, and potentially the 2060 carbon neutrality goal that was announced by President Xi last fall. However, it's far easier for China to pledge relatively ambitious long-term goals than near-term goals, especially during this five-year plan period, which extends, through 2025, while the economy is still recovering from the global pandemic. China's 14th five-year plan targets released last month are relatively conservative, I think, as a result of this. Many of the 13th five-year plan targets, in fact, were not met. And there is this need for reinvigorated economic growth coming out of the pandemic, and a fear, I think, among the leadership that aggressive climate targets could prevent that. So as a result, while China technically could still meet its 14th five-year plan targets while still growing overall emissions, and that's somewhat concerning. And the targets in this plan are also potentially out of line with ambitious global climate goals, the more ambitious sort of pathways, including a 1.5 degree goal. So this is to say, I think this is why global engagement with China will be critical in the coming days, months, and years, and why I think the US-China joint statement released over the weekend, signaling that China will indeed revisit these near-term goals and clarify its long-term carbon neutrality strategy, could potentially be quite significant. So I will stop there, and of course, happy to elaborate on any of these points.
Geez, great comments, Joanna. Really appreciate it. We'll talk about China in a minute, but I want to turn it over to the Russian side of the house and let Jonathan have his say. Jonathan?
Thank you very much, and thanks to the American Security Project for the opportunity to be with you all today. It's really an important legacy, frankly, that the project itself has created, making plain by its focus and framing of these issues that in fact, climate is a national security concern. It's one that touches just about every aspect of our national security posture. If we're to talk about the geopolitics of climate change, then that's about influence and power and prestige on the international stage. And so the conversation that we're having today that focuses in particular on Russia and China is important, but it also is important in terms of comparisons back to what the United States is planning to do and has done previously. So our discussion today shouldn't only be considered to be about China and Russia, but also about the United States and the role that we wish to play, the extent that we wish to provide leadership on the global stage. Russia is, in that regard, let me just focus on the Russia side of it. It's a tricky case because while Russia has never been a country that is short on scientific and technical expertise, it has been a country that has a long history of at least ambivalence about responding to the climate challenge. In fact, one of the strongest threads in Russian policymaking since the kind of late 1980s, early 1990s, when this issue emerged onto the global stage, has been that of climate skeptic. And here I think about people like the very famous head of the Soviet and then Russian Hydrometeorological Service, Yuri Israel, who was very involved in the first couple of assessments under the IPCC, but who, and who, by the way, it was credited by that community in the IPCC and the World Meteorological Organization as being the originator of the idea of comprehensive environmental monitoring, a very important and powerful idea. Nonetheless, he was one of the early and persistent voices that you still see playing out in the policy of President Vladimir Putin. And that is a viewpoint that says, well, the climate may be changing, it might be anthropogenic in origins, but on net, that's not a bad thing for Russia. I think that argument is wrong, but nonetheless, it's been a very, very powerful thread. So the conversation that I just referred to, that of the climate skeptics in Russia, has also been accompanied increasingly, as would befit a scientific powerhouse that Russia frankly is. It has been accompanied by a very strong understanding and an increasingly vocal expression of the understanding that Russia will experience negative impacts from climate, whether one is talking about invasive species that accompany the temperature rises across the expanse of the Russian state, whether one talks about changes in hydrological patterns that can lead to inland massive flooding, or for that matter, droughts and both peat and forest wildfires, lots of threatening implications for Russia, including for the Russian built environment. Now, everybody knows that the landmass of the Russian Federation is indeed a thing to behold, but the built environment and economic activity is where the rubber meets the road in terms of policy tensions. And it has been very important that there is an increasing focus on negative impacts related to the built environment, whether one is talking about the subsidence of buildings and roads and railways on what has historically been permafrost in the Russian Arctic, whether one is talking about bridges and river basin pipelines that all of a sudden are not any longer able to withstand water flows that exceed all design limits, whether one is talking about long distance electric power transmission lines that degrade due to increasing heat and indeed wildfires like we've seen in California. So you have this tension that I'm trying to draw out between the skepticism, hey, it's on net, we don't mind having a warmer Russia, and the very considerable capability of the Russian scientific community. And you see some very important developments and questions that are being asked. The Russian nationally determined contribution, the climate target, frankly, is not especially, not at all ambitious. It was 25 to 30% below a 1990 level. And Russia has considerably exceeded that. Now, I leave it as one of the points for discussion as to whether the fact that Russia indeed experienced massive economic impacts as a consequence of the ending of its previous political economic system, whether that certainly brought good news for the climate, but it could not be claimed that that represents policymaking intended to demonstrate Russia's commitment to moving on this issue. What might lie ahead? Well, that piece again takes us back to the interactions in part between the United States and Russia. I expect that President Putin, if indeed he participates as planned in the summit on Thursday, will tell the world that Russia's natural gas systems are world leading and don't leak methane, which is, I think, a point that is increasingly understood to be dubious. And I here point to some of the work that has been done on remote sensing of methane leakage, an important area of focus. I think it's also important to think about some of the challenges that Russia will face as the European Union considers regulations relating to the natural gas that is imported into their market. And I would say that Russian industry is increasingly aware that it is not immune from the advance of ESG, environmental, social, and governance requirements that one sees becoming increasingly common in the financial community. And there's been some very good work that addresses these issues done by the Skolkovo Moscow School of Management that I would commend to anybody who's interested. Some really very good work. So let me just wrap up. I noted that the geopolitics of climate are about the influence, power, and prestige that relate to different countries' activities in relation to climate change. There is, of course, in the US-Russian broader interaction, a huge universe of complicated geopolitics, maybe even more complicated and even more poisonous than the already complicated US-China relationship is. My hope is that later this week and then going forward, there can be some concerted focus on the need for climate solutions. And in that regard, maybe there is the prospect for some quiet, technocratic, but productive collaborations that might take place between the US and Russia in this space.
Jonathan, great comments. Thank you. Joanna, I want to start with you and just talk about China again for a second here. And when you look at what's going on in the Asia-Pacific theater and the refocus theoretically of our defense establishment against China's increasing encroachment on the seas there and what it's doing in our talks about reshaping our military as a competitor against them, you turn to climate change, and now we're trying to work as an area of cooperation between the two of us. So we ought to be viewing climate change, both China and us, as a threat to our, not just our own stability and security, but worldwide stability and security. So I guess my point to this is, what do you think should there be more policy recommendations coming out of the Biden administration as to how we approach China? And I'm not necessarily using a carrot and a stick approach to this, but some have talked about carbon tax, those types of things, further sanctions. I don't see either of those occurring in the near term anyway, but what's your perspective on that?
Sure. I mean, I think that, you know, the Biden administration is, on the one hand, dealing with the fact that climate change is, you know, not only a top domestic issue for this administration, it is a top foreign policy issue. And we see that, you know, with the summit this week and the other announcements that have been made. And on the other hand, of course, the US-China relationship and the whole, you know, wide range of issues that have to be very carefully navigated there, from security to trade to human rights and you know, around the gamut. So I think that they're really trying to find this balance in how you can work with China on, you know, arguably one of the most existential global threats of our time, in climate change, and still, you know, be able to have a hard line on these issues where we have, you know, real disagreements, and where China is truly, you know, disruptive of the global order, and, you know, working directly against, I think, American, you know, values and political objectives. So, you know, but I think that the way that this is being framed by the Biden administration is that, I mean, so first of all, setting the aim to have a climate summit of global leaders within the first 100 days always meant that one of the, you know, the first high level meetings between, you know, potentially President Xi, if he comes, and President Biden was going to be on climate specifically, right? I mean, this is a summit about climate. It's not about, you know, a bilateral or multilateral summit on a wide range of issues. So this, I think, does allow us to kind of carve out a lane to work with China. And, you know, you may ask, well, why would we want to do that, you know, given the broader context of the relationship? But I actually think it's directly in the United States interest to do so, you know, and I'm well aware of the complications surrounding, you know, a lot of the aspects of what our cooperation actually looks like. I mean, when we talk about cooperation, I think people don't always know, what does that really look like, right? Is this high level meetings, dialogues, or what are we talking about here? And, you know, the vast majority, you know, as John knows very well, has been on science technology cooperation, run out of DOE and elsewhere. And this is really about sharing experiences with low carbon technologies. And there's a real competitiveness angle to this, particularly as China has, I think, pulled ahead of the United States in many of the key low carbon technology areas that we are going to need, you know, domestically to address our own climate situation. But that said, China is now the largest living laboratory for low carbon technologies, and they have this ability to scale technologies that is of direct benefit to US companies, US research labs. And so I think we just have to be smart and find ways to work with them. You know, I think on your issue of just, you know, carrots versus sticks, you know, the way that the Paris Agreement is set up is there's not a lot of sticks, right? I mean, there's not even a lot of carrots, right? It's just sort of this process whereby, you know, we're sort of hoping for a race to the top, right? Where what, you know, and that was what I think the 2014 US-China joint announcement did, when both countries, you know, got up before the rest of the world, announced their pledges for the Paris Agreement a full year in advance of the Paris summit. And that was able to really leverage, you know, a huge amount of global goodwill and global climate action. And I think, you know, we're not going to see the same, you know, the same model, I think, leading into COP26, because I do think the politics are different and the dynamics are different. I mean, we've been out of the game, you know, the United States, and China has been pushing forward, you know, on relatively ambitious climate and energy goals. They still have a long way to go, as I mentioned, but so, you know, I think that there's a lot of discussion right now in the EU and elsewhere, of course, about carbon border adjustments. I think these types of tools could be very useful to leveling the playing field, particularly for trade exposed industries. You know, but that said, China is launching one of the largest carbon markets in the world. And while it's still, again, in the early stages, it's actually quite possible that a few years from now, China would be, in a position to actually meet a lot of these carbon, trade policies and actually lead in them as well.
I think obviously one of the greatest criticisms of the Paris Accord was that it was toothless. I mean, you set your own goals here and determine whether you made them or not. And of course, the financial side of the house was really not addressed. But COP26 will start getting into the finance side of the house. So do you think there's leverage here when we come into COP26 to push them harder?
Them being China. I mean, I think that, China they're being very strategic about the role that they play, particularly sort of as a champion of the developing world, right? In these negotiations. I mean, China has long been sort of the voice of the G77. And I think, we've seen some fracturing, of course, in this, as early as Copenhagen and now you have the, really different understanding, I think, across the developing world, where you have kind of the winners and losers of all of this. And I think it's interesting to hear about how Russia kind of positions themselves, right, as a potential winner in the climate, in climate change. So, I think that we see China really upping its game in South-South cooperation. China is financing projects throughout the developing world, clean energy projects. But then on the other hand, of course, we know about the Belt and Road Initiative and the, vast investments that are still occurring in fossil energy, coal plants and whatnot, also, throughout a lot of the emerging and developing economies. And so I think what we need to see is, not just kind of a push, through the Paris channels, but a much broader look at the role that countries are playing in financing energy infrastructure globally, and what the role is, of public, privates. In China, it's complicated, right? Because a lot of these are state-owned banks doing this. It's not a government program per se, right? But the lines are obviously gray. So, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure kind of in this broader realm, which is not sort of how we narrowly think about climate finance, but is really about kind of shifting infrastructure towards low carbon investments. And China has an important role, I think, to actually play in that.
Jonathan, your comments?
Yeah, I wonder if I'd come in on that. So, look, a couple things I think are really important that we haven't yet brought out to the fore in this discussion. One is that I really struggle. I mean, when I seize on Joanna's carrots and sticks, I think you have to really look with some skepticism at the notion that climate policy, which for the most part is about energy policy, it's also about agriculture, it's also about other things, but substantially the mass is about energy policy. I think it's pretty hard to argue the idea that countries can be forced into doing things in the climate policy space that they don't wish to do already. Now, you can use moral suasion, you can use name and shame, you can use carrots in the forms of know-how, capital, availability of low-cost finance, et cetera. All of those tools are relevant, but I really struggle with the notion that we're going to be able to force China or anybody else to do things that they're not fundamentally ready to do. The good news, and this is some strange good news, is that China also needs climate solutions, right? China is itself extraordinarily vulnerable to the impacts of a changing climate. Look at the location of the vast majority or the huge share of the Chinese population in the major cities that would be potentially impacted by rising sea levels. Look at Shanghai, where Secretary Kerry and Xi Jinping just met in recent days. My colleague David Sandelow shows an amazing and frankly chastening visualization of how much of today's modern Shanghai would be underwater at meter of sea level rise, 1.5, it's the kind of visualization that ought to send shivers down the spine of any policymaker. And the last point on this, what's interesting in the China versus Russia comparison is that the Chinese, for the most part, those that I have dealt with in my time inside and outside of government, do not deny the reality of climate change and of anthropogenic causation, human causation of climate change. They may have different views about historical responsibility. They may try to position China as the great protector of the developing world. But different from that is the question of whether or not climate is an issue that needs to be dealt with. In Russia, there are, as I said, and I want to stress, there are these incredibly capable decision makers, both in the research community and then also in business and in some places in government roles. But the prevailing sentiment is one that is fundamentally climate skeptic, and that's a harder thing to deal with. That makes them a harder partner.
Yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with any of what you said. And it's really a contrast when you look at the approach of Russia to climate change and China to climate change. And we know China is being driven to it, of course, by as you pointed out, the huge impacts that the climate change is having on them, and they could be incredibly greater. Looking at Russia, it's kind of interesting, especially as an exporter of natural gas. And some view, we do a little bit at ASP, natural gas as a bridge fuel, if you will, but obviously it still burns and sends that CO2 in the atmosphere. But you would kind of think that Russia would look longer term and think, as the world goes to renewables here, their income and dependence using natural gas is going to wane. And of course, there are others who are exporting natural gas, Qatar and other countries that can underprice them in a heartbeat. So you would think that looking farther down the pike, they would think, okay, we need to invest more in renewables here because longer term, we can't entirely depend on this natural gas side of the house. So Putin, I'm glad he's going to participate on Thursday. I wonder what he's going to say and how much veracity you can put into what his comments are going to be. But do you have any thoughts on what I've just said about renewables versus natural gas?
Look, I mean, you make a very important point that one of the open questions is what is the future of natural gas? The body language coming out of the EU in connection with the European Green Deal, and that the EU has been Russia's historical main export market for natural gas. The body language is, not terribly long. Now, that is an oversimplified, well, my caricature is doubly oversimplified because it was a caricature, but there are certain European EU member states that are not eager to see a sunsetting of natural gas in their markets. Here I'm thinking about Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, where they are trying to get off of coal, and that is one of the mandates that they must deliver on under the European Green Deal. And so they're not so keen to have their options foreclosed. They're happy to purchase gas from elsewhere. As a matter of fact, they'd be happier by far, many of those Central and Eastern European states, not to be buying gas from Russia because of some of the political loading that they feel has traditionally accompanied it. But to have gas not be one of their options is not always the most favored outcome there. One of the things that Russia could be doing, and you see here a variety of levels of performance by different Russian companies. One of the things that Russia could be doing much more aggressively that would be a really important positive step would be to diagnose and to fix methane leakage along the Gazprom pipeline system and upstream, frankly, as well. here I want to be clear. Methane leakage is not a uniquely Russian problem. We have a big problem with this in the United States, in the Permian Basin, and frankly, we have failed to take full account of the extent of our methane leakage problems around the globe, in part because in this country and in Russia and in many others, we have used engineering estimates to create our inventory of methane emissions, and those engineering estimates are considerably inaccurate, as has become clearer and clearer with better monitoring systems. So Russia's attention to methane leakage along the value chain would be a hugely important step forward. I would encourage any members of the audience that are interested to pay particular attention to the importance that attends to the relatively short lifetime in the atmosphere of methane. The plain English version of this is reductions in methane emissions that you do today are extraordinarily powerful in terms of how much the atmosphere actually warms. Sorry for the long monologue.
No, great comment. It's kind of along the lines of do as I say, not as I do when it comes to the United States and methane capture. And I'm sure that's not lost on Russians for sure.
Well, and look, I mean, pardon me for jumping back in. You're putting your finger on a really, really important point, which is we're having this conversation because we all agree that one of the really big signal challenges of our era is getting our arms around and addressing climate change, finding climate solutions. The sad thing is that in the last 4 years, the United States shot itself right in the foot and harmed the ability of the global community to find those global solutions. We were a big obstacle. And so guess what? When it comes to geopolitics of climate change, we got a credibility problem that we have to work through. And I hope that the seriousness that we see today from the Biden administration is matched by seriousness by partners on the other side of the aisle, because we have to be part of the solution here.
Yeah, I mean, there's another one that I couldn't agree with more, that we got a lot of work to do, and not to get too much into the politics and the fossil fuel industry's grip on our government and what's gone on the last 4 years. The Biden administration no doubt has its work cut out for us. Can I remind the audience that the Q&A function still exists here? So if you could hit that and add a question, if you got it under the, just hit the Q&A function and type in your question. Another one for both of you. I think when you look at the draft climate plans, certainly from Russia, that I think was released in March, their emissions actually increase up to 2030. I think I've said that right, Jonathan. And then China's 5-year plan actually allows emissions to continue rising only through 2025. Do we have any leverage to get them to change those policies? I mean, if I've said that accurately, Joanna?
Well, I mean, I think the numbers you're pointing to are really quite speculative at this point. I mean, and I think actually if China's emissions rise until 2025 and then peak and decline, we would be in very good shape. I think at this point, that's sort of the earliest that we're likely to see emissions peak in China. I mean, as you know, what they pledged in Paris was to peak by 2030. And we've seen them kind of inching that up a little bit. But honestly, given the trends that we're seeing in coal consumption just the last couple of years, I mean, coal, a lot of experts were saying coal use had peaked in China back in 2014. And we now know that 2020 consumption is above 2014 levels in China and is creeping back up. And a lot of this is driven by economic stimulus and the incentives that are just being put in place by the government to incentivize coal, which really, I mean, of course, directly conflicts with a lot of the energy climate targets. And, I think it's when you look at China's power system, there's just huge inefficiencies, right? Just in the way that in parts of the country, you have coal plants that are going completely underutilized, and other, parts of the country, you still have these shortages. And a lot of this is not technical. I mean, these are political economy issues, driven at the local level, which I won't get into. But, I think in terms of where China is and in terms of global emissions trends, I mean, I think we're actually in a worse situation now than we were a few years ago, looking at trajectories for China's targets. And I think, the light at the end of the tunnel is, of course, this 2060 carbon neutrality announcement, which, I think caught many by surprise. And if China can really get to carbon, neutral by 2060, this would actually be quite ambitious. But what all their models say, including the models coming out of the Research Institute at Tsinghua that, current climate envoy Xie Jinhua was running until recently when he was pulled out of retirement. The modeling was basically showing that China's emissions will rise through 2030 and then just, drop precipitously to 2060 at a rate that we've just never seen any country, able to achieve in history. And of course, the economic cost of that is substantial, because you're talking about shutting plants down long before their useful lifetime. In China, the lifetime of a lot of these coal plants would be less than 10 years, if not even, less than that. So I think this is not a good trend. And so, I think that it's really going to be important to see what China brings forward. I think, the joint statement really does signal that there's going to be new targets forthcoming, whether it's this week or in the coming weeks and months. And so I do think that's constructive.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Jonathan, your thoughts?
Well, again, if I'm right in the assertion that we can't force any country to do particular things on climate, then really the power of the Paris Agreement, and I do think that it is in this regard a very powerful agreement, is the idea that we're kind of clamping our arms around each other and all walking forward together. I mean, it cannot be effective for the United States to act alone on climate. For them, it cannot be effective for everybody except for China to try to do their utmost to solve the problem, or frankly, for the rest of the world to try to do its utmost, and the US is sitting on its hands. We must all act together. That means that the kind of the moral suasion, I'm doing more, can you do more conversation, which is a neighboring idea to name and shame. That is where the power lies in the Paris Agreement, and we should not underestimate it. We also should not underestimate the importance and the power of the United States competing in this global marketplace, right? We are united in the dissatisfaction that so much new coal-fired power has been constructed by the Belt and Road Initiative around the globe. Well, are we, as the United States, mobilizing enough technical know-how and combination of public and private capital that can be a viable alternative for developing countries that need more energy services? If we're not, then bad on us. So, I mean, this is a matter where we don't get to dictate to the Chinese or to anybody else, but surely by playing our own cards as strongly as possible, we can exert positive influence.
No, great comments. I think I can turn now to some questions from our audience, and we've got a very distinguished audience, and one of them is Admiral Morissetti, who's been a longtime friend of ASP's, and his question is, if Russia is unable to sell gas to Europe, it will look to other markets, including China. Do the panelists, do you see a situation where China seeks to exert influence on Russia towards cleaner gas and lower emissions? Interesting question. Any thoughts from either one of you on this?
Joanna, do you want to start?
I mean, I would just say briefly that, I think China would really like to expand its use of natural gas from wherever it can get it, and including, conversations with Russia. But, China natural gas still plays a very small role in China's total energy mix, and they've been relatively unsuccessful at scaling that up gradually, and I think that's one of the problems that we see in China's power grid, just because when you're essentially mixing coal, renewables, and large hydro, It's a very different system for integrating large amounts of low carbon energy, and nuclear as well, I should say. You know, China has big ambitions there. And I know there's a question on this, but again, they've been falling short of a lot of their nuclear targets. And so, you know, I think these are all areas where China would like to diversify. But perhaps John can speak to the geopolitics of it.
Well, I would just say that the Russia-China natural gas relationship has been famously scratchy throughout decades. Now, the Power of Siberia pipeline is now in existence, operating. That does not mean that some of the tensions and mutual distrust have been erased entirely, but at least the kind of the commercial operation is going on. As a matter of fact, there's a very good piece from, I think it was February, that a friend of mine, Ed Chow, put out from the Carnegie Moscow Center, entitled Sino-Russian Energy Relations, A Match Made in Heaven. The paper makes the important point that one of the ironic potential outcomes that may develop is a much closer energy relationship between China and Russia as a consequence of how our geopolitics and our energy politics have unfolded in recent years. Would China exert influence for low emissions methane? I don't know. That would in part, I think, depend on the development of capabilities, and they are just over the horizon, pardon the pun, capabilities to monitor leakage of methane and other greenhouse gases around the globe. A number of colleagues at the Columbia Energy Center and I did a piece last October on this issue of satellite monitoring of methane emissions. And the developments are really very exciting and will give us the ability increasingly to know what emissions are coming from where. And that's really going to be very important going forward.
Wow, great comments. Kind of feeding a little bit on that, we have a question from General Bob Barnes, long a friend of ASP. Are Russia and or China investing in carbon capture, either for storage or utilization? And if so, are their investments mostly in the R&D space, or are there indications that either or both are working on contemplating actual CCS and CCU projects? Is this a potential area where the U.S. could collaborate with either country? Interesting question on carbon capture. Joanna, any thought on that one?
Well, I think, you know, there's been a lot of interest in carbon capture in China for a while. I mean, because it makes a lot of sense given, you know, particularly the coal dependence there. But there have been a lot of international efforts to cooperate with China focused on CCS, CCUS that haven't really gone anywhere. The UK over a decade ago started a big net zero emissions coal plant project with China. Australia had a project, US had a project. There were a few kind of multilateral projects, and all of them, you know, really did some really interesting scoping studies and sort of economic assessment studies, geologic studies of where you could do storage and whatnot. But when you start to get to the pilot plant stage and you know, look at building demonstration projects, they're just so costly, right? And I mean, they're cheaper to build in China than really anywhere else in the world. So if you're going to try to get these plants built and demonstrate them, it makes a lot of sense to potentially do it there. But you know, unfortunately, it's been a lot slower moving than I think many would have liked. And I think until you have the policy incentives in China, you know, whether it's a carbon price, which is, I think, a ways off, or, you know, I mean, the government is throwing a lot of R&D support into it. But it seems like the focus has shifted away from it in recent years, from where it was a few years ago, and instead focusing much more on low carbon energy sources.
Yeah, we kind of wish it was both, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no doubt. Jonathan, any thoughts on the Russian side?
I'm not aware, but this could be my ignorance. I'm not aware of major Russian efforts in the carbon capture universe. But again, like, you know, no shortage of scientific and engineering talent in that country. So the possibilities, at least, are there. excuse me, there in the abstract. Whether the policy signals coming from the Kremlin are supportive of that or not, that's the rub.
Yeah, Jonathan, I know you used to do some work with DOE, and we at ASP follow investment at DOE on any new technologies that might help improve the environment and reduce CO2 in the atmosphere. And our personal opinion is that that investment has been curtailed somewhat over the last 4 years. So we're kind of hoping that this current administration will invest more in new technologies. Do you see any technological cooperation between us and Russia or us and China on other technologies? Fusion, for example, would be one, or other renewable sides of the house for both.
Yeah, look, one of the things that my group at DOE focused on a great deal in the lead up to the Paris climate negotiations was the launching of a collaboration called Mission Innovation. And so that structure was meant to facilitate collaborations where there was a kind of natural pairing of interests. Notice my terminology, natural pairing of interests. In a variety of different technological arenas. At times, the challenge of some collaborations with the Chinas and Russias and others goes to some of the more macroeconomic irritants back and forth. So are there really effective structures to protect intellectual property? To the extent that any of these technologies are important economic opportunities, job creators going forward, where does the job creation happen? So that's a set of issues that we looked at very carefully at the time. We also had bilateral collaborations under the Clean Energy Research Center with China, which I have to say, one of the real strong elements of that was that because some of that collaboration kind of had the holy water of presidential attention put onto it, there were not IP problems that occurred there. Well, there was one instance where a US company came and told us that they felt that their technology was being picked up by a local counterparty in China, and that came to an end right away because of the IP protection structure that was set up as a companion to the collaborations under the CERC. So it's a tricky area. There may be opportunities for collaboration. I think this is a case where we need to walk carefully and slowly and rebuild real confidence in the opportunities to do this kind of collaboration. It is possible that we get there, but I think this is something where one needs to, in President Reagan's inimitable words, trust but verify. Yeah.
Well said. Any thought on that, Joanna?
Yeah, I would just add briefly, I mean, there's a question about fusion, and both China and the United States are part of ITER, the main kind of multilateral research group on
You're
that.
very familiar with ITER, sure.
Yeah, there is ITER. So, that's sort of what's there, right? But if you look at the joint statement, again, from last weekend, I mean, I think it actually lays out the technologies where we're likely to see cooperation, if any, going forward between the US and China. And, the first set are kind of build on status quo cooperation. Carbon capture is mentioned, renewables, buildings, low carbon transportation, sort of the obvious ones where we've been cooperating with China for, 3-4 decades now. But then several new areas are called out that I think is worth mentioning. Green hydrogen, which is, an area where China is actually really leading the way in a lot of really interesting R&D. Aviation, maritime emissions reductions and technologies for that is, a really important area. And then reductions in non-CO2 greenhouse gases, including methane, as was discussed. So, these are all areas where we have not worked with China before in any substantial way. And so I think it's interesting that they've been, really called out in this statement as potentially important areas going forward.
No, great comments. We're running right up on the 3 o'clock hour here, so I want to give you both an opportunity if you want to make any closing comment for maybe about a minute or so. Jonathan, any thoughts?
Well, I guess that the one thought that comes to mind kind of takes us back to my remarks at the start. The U.S. has been out of the game for 4 years. Sadly, this is not the only time that the U.S. took itself out of the game. We did so as well back in the year 2000. When we act in that way, pendulum swinging from in to out to in, we harm our credibility. And to me, that communicates a message to policymakers on both sides of the aisle. I stress on both sides of the aisle, that we do need to be part of the solution set for the big challenges of our day, that we also have to focus on how can we create stability and predictability of the policy environment in the United States. And that calls for that crazy compromise word, but it is vital that we find the way to make it real while we are making progress on climate.
No, great comments. And I think that could be the basis for a whole nother panel. Joanna, your thoughts?
I know we're out of time, so just very briefly, I mean, I think this is going to be a really interesting week to watch. This is the start of the year that was supposed to happen last year, which was supposed to be the 5 years beyond Paris, and really trying to take the next steps to mobilize global action. And so, there's going to be a series of really important global summits to watch this year. The G7, the G20, you have the UK and Italy sort of, with this unified front in trying to push forward, a multi-tiered set of these global processes that will hopefully result in increased ambition, by COP26 at the end of the year. So it's going to be challenging doing it at this year, right? In this sort of post-pandemic recovery where countries are really focusing on a lot of other issues. But I do think there's a lot of synergies in the, what we're calling building back better, right? And thinking through economic stimulus recovery in a green way. And as we saw back in the financial crisis in 2009, where China put a huge amount of money in green stimulus. I mean, that was actually instrumental in their taking the lead in a lot of these industries. So I think in many ways this year is an opportunity, and I hope we're able to see some constructive movement.
I mean, I think there's huge hope on the horizon, but you have both pointed out the ups and the downs of everything that's occurring. And so we can see you've both been fantastic, true professionals in this. I really, really appreciate you taking the time. And of course, we look forward to what's going to happen Thursday and Friday. So with that, I say thank you both very much. And thanks to the audience for being on the call.